On a quiet Thursday morning, Henry Lawson stepped off the bus just as he always did, holding the same worn-out cane he had carried for years. The small grocery store stood across the road, its sliding doors opening and closing as people walked in and out. Henry took a slow breath, straightened his back as much as he could, and began to walk toward it. His movements were steady but careful, each step placed with intention. Age had not been kind to his joints, and he often felt the weight of time. Settling into his bones, Henry was a man who preferred silence over noise and peace over crowds. He had served his country long ago, in a chapter of his life he rarely spoke about anymore. Most people who passed him on the street saw only an elderly man with white hair, soft eyes, and a slow walk. They never realized that behind those quiet steps lived decades of courage, memories, and stories he kept tucked away. He came to this store every Thursday not because he needed much, but because the routine gave him comfort. He liked seeing familiar aisles, familiar shelves, and familiar faces. Even if he never talked much, he enjoyed feeling like he still belonged somewhere as Henry pushed the door open. The chilly air inside brushed against his face. He reached for a small cart, gripping it a little tighter for balance. A few shoppers walked by talking on their phones or rushing through their lists, barely noticing him. Henry didn't mind. He never expected attention. He moved slowly through the produce section, scanning the apples before choosing only 3. His hands, although shaky, were gentle as he placed them into a small bag. He picked up some bread, milk, and a few things for the week. Every item he added to the cart was chosen with care. He lived alone now, in a small apartment not far from the bus stop. He didn't need much, but he always made sure he had enough. While he continued shopping, 2 younger men entered the store, their voices loud and filled with careless laughter. They were joking with each other, nudging one another as they walked. Henry didn't pay attention at first. He simply turned his cart down the next aisle, minding his own business. But as he moved, he could sense a shift in the air. It was subtle at first, the sound of footsteps trailing a little too close, the faint sound of whispering behind him. Henry didn't turn around. He had learned long ago that some situations calm down if you don't feed them. Still, he could feel the unease beginning to settle in his stomach. One of the young men spoke just loud enough for Henry to hear, though the tone was light and mocking. "Look at this guy. Moves slower than my old bike," his friend laughed, clearly amused. Henry's grip tightened slightly on the cart handle, but he didn't respond. He kept his eyes forward. Focusing on the shelves, he had experienced moments like these before. Small comments, passing remarks, things that younger people said without thinking. Sometimes they were harmless, sometimes they stung a little, but he always tried to overlook them. He believed that reacting only made things worse. Still, the laughter behind him didn't stop. The 2 men stayed close, walking behind him as though the entire aisle was their playground. Henry moved a little faster, hoping they would lose interest. But the sound of their sniggering continued. Henry paused near the canned goods, pretending to read the labels even though he already knew what he needed. He waited a moment, hoping they would pass by. Instead, the men stood only a few feet away, whispering again. Their comments weren't loud enough for others to catch, but Henry heard every word. He took a deep breath, reminding himself to stay calm. He didn't want to cause a scene. He didn't want attention or pity. He only wanted to finish his shopping and go home. After gathering the last few items on his list, Henry slowly pushed his cart toward the front of the store. The checkout lines were moderately busy, with people standing in quiet rows, scrolling through their phones or staring into space. Henry moved into the shortest line, right behind a woman unloading her groceries onto the belt. Just as he reached for the small divider bar to separate his items, one of the young men bumped into the back of Henry's cart. The jolt startled him, and he turned slightly, unsure if it was accidental or intentional. The man smirked. "Sorry, old man," he said, though his tone made it clear he wasn't sorry at all. Henry felt his chest tighten, a mix of nerves and embarrassment rushing through him. He forced a small nod and went back to placing his items on the belt. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted the bread, and the moment didn't go unnoticed. "Look at that," the other man whispered loudly enough. Shaking like he's lifting weights, Henry pretended not to hear, but the comments were beginning to sting. Not because they were harsh, but because they reminded him of a loneliness he rarely admitted. He had spent years fighting battles many people never saw. And now, in the quiet years of his life, something as simple as buying groceries had turned into another moment of discomfort. The cashier glanced up briefly, noticing the men's behavior. She looked unsure, her eyes darting between Henry and the two men. She didn't say anything, not yet. She seemed nervous, perhaps worried about making things worse. Henry lifted the last item from his cart, his hands shaking more than usual. He wished they would stop. He wished he didn't feel so exposed. He wished, for once, that someone would step in, not to defend him, but simply to make the moment feel less heavy. A couple of nearby shoppers noticed the situation, but quickly looked away, pretending to focus on their groceries. No one wanted to get involved. No one wanted trouble. Henry understood that. Years had taught him that people often avoided conflict, even when it meant ignoring someone who needed help. He tried to steady his breathing, reminding himself that this moment would pass. He only had to pay for his things, take his bags, and leave. He reminded himself that he had endured far worse. And yet, standing there in line, he felt more powerless than he had in a long time. He reached into his coat pocket for his wallet. His fingers fumbled inside, brushing against old coins and folded receipts. The tremor in his hands made it difficult to grip the wallet properly, and it slipped slightly before he caught it again. Behind him, two men laughed quietly. Henry's face grew warm with embarrassment. He lowered his eyes, wishing he could disappear into the floor. He didn't want attention. He didn't want pity. He just wanted this moment to end. As he opened his wallet, the trembling grew worse. A few bills slipped from his fingers, fluttering toward the floor. Henry tried to bend down, but his back stiffened painfully, making the simple action feel like a struggle. Before he could reach for the bills, one of the young men leaned in, picked them up, and held them out to him. For a moment, Henry thought the gesture might be kind. But the man smirked again. "You're welcome," he said in a tone that made it sound like a joke. Henry took the bills slowly, his voice too soft to offer more than a faint "thank you." His pride felt chipped, like an old piece of wood worn thin over time. He straightened up as much as he could and looked forward again, hoping the line would move faster. He didn't know it yet, but someone else had been watching from a few steps behind. Someone who had seen the entire situation unfold quietly and calmly. Someone whose presence would soon change everything. For now, though, Henry remained focused on the checkout, trying his best to appear steady. Even as the weight of the moment pressed heavily on him, Henry stood quietly in the checkout line, trying to steady his breathing as he watched the conveyor belt move his groceries forward. The air around him felt heavy, like a thick cloud he couldn't push away. The cashier continued scanning items one by one, offering him a small, polite smile whenever their eyes met. She seemed to sense the tension, but didn't know how to ease it behind him. The two young men were still lingering too close, whispering to each other and laughing under their breath. Henry felt their presence like a weight pressing against his back. He tried to focus on the small things, the hum of the conveyor belt, the soft beep of items being scanned, the faint music playing overhead. Anything to drown out the uneasiness growing inside him. He kept his eyes low, hoping that avoiding eye contact would make the situation pass more quickly. But every second felt longer than the one before it. He wished he could move faster, wished his hands didn't shake so much, wished he didn't feel so exposed. The cashier handed him the total. Henry reached for his wallet again, hoping his hands would obey this time. He opened it carefully, counting his bills one by one. As he handed them over, another small tremor ran through his fingers. The cashier took the money without making a face, though her eyes softened with concern. Henry felt a wave of relief wash over him. He had paid. He was almost done. All he needed to do was take his groceries and leave the store. He reached for the bag handles, but just as he did, one of the bags tilted slightly, and a loaf of bread nearly slipped out. Before he could fix it, one of the young men leaned forward again. "Want me to carry your bags too?" he asked, pretending to be helpful. His voice held no real kindness, only mockery. Henry swallowed hard. "No, thank you," he said quietly. The man shrugged and whispered something to his friend, who laughed again. A few people in nearby lines noticed but quickly turned away. No one wanted to step in. No one wanted to risk drawing attention. Henry slowly lifted the bags, holding them close to his chest so his shaky hands wouldn't drop anything. He turned to leave the checkout area, wishing the exit wasn't so far away. He could feel the men still watching him, waiting for another moment to make a joke. But just as he took his first step forward, one of them walked directly into his path. It wasn't a hard bump, not enough to knock him down, but it was enough to make him freeze in place. The man stared at him for a moment, then stepped to the side with an exaggerated gesture. "Go ahead," he said, as if granting permission. Henry didn't reply. He simply lowered his gaze and walked past him. His heart pounded in his chest. Every step felt like he was walking through thick mud. He wanted to get out, breathe fresh air, and leave the whole moment behind him. But the two men weren't done. They followed him. Their footsteps slow and heavy, as if they were trying to intimidate him without doing anything directly wrong. Henry could feel his throat tighten. He avoided looking back, hoping they would lose interest. The store was crowded enough that their behavior wasn't obvious to everyone. But the people who did notice didn't know what to do. Some looked uncomfortable, others looked away. A few glanced around as if waiting for someone else to step in first. Henry reached the end. It took a moment to adjust his bags. He placed them carefully in his cart so he wouldn't risk dropping anything. His hands ached from gripping them too hard, but he didn't want to let it show. He repositioned his cane, took a steadying breath, and started moving toward the store exit just as he did. The two men appeared on either side of him. "Hey," one of them said casually, like he was starting a friendly conversation. "You ever think of getting one of those electric carts? Might be easier for someone your age." Henry felt his stomach twist. He knew they weren't trying to help. He wished he could simply ignore them, but their presence was too strong, too close. "I'm fine," he said softly. "You sure?" the other man asked, stepping a little too close. "You look like you're going to fall over any second." Henry didn't respond. He kept walking, trying to focus on the store's exit. The sliding doors felt miles away. A young woman passing by noticed what was happening. She hesitated, slowing her steps as if she might say something. But when the two men glanced her way, she quickly turned and hurried off. Henry didn't blame her. People didn't like getting involved. He understood that. Still, the loneliness hit him harder than he expected. As he neared the exit, one of the men nudged his friend and whispered loudly, "Maybe we should help him out to his car. Don't want him tripping." Henry pushed his cart a little faster. He didn't have a car. He always took the bus. But he didn't want them to know that. He didn't want to give them more reason to follow him. The automatic doors finally opened, letting in a soft breeze. Henry felt a bit of relief as the fresh air touched his face. He stepped forward, hoping the men would stay behind, but they didn't. They walked out with him, still talking and laughing. Henry glanced around the parking lot, trying to decide what to do. He didn't want to wait at the bus stop with them nearby. He didn't want to walk somewhere unfamiliar. He didn't want to be followed. He stood for a moment, unsure. His hands trembled again as he adjusted his grip on his cart. A man in plain clothes, who had been standing near the front doors, watched the whole scene unfold. He had been observing quietly, his posture calm and steady. He saw the young men's behavior. He saw Henry's discomfort. He saw the way people around them looked worried, but stayed silent now. He took a slow step closer. Henry didn't notice him at first. He was too focused on the two men hovering nearby. "You need help getting to your car?" one of them asked, smirking. Henry shook his head. "No, I'm okay," he said, though his voice wavered. "You sure?" The man pressed, leaning a little too close. "Looks like you could use a hand." Before Henry could respond again, a calm, steady voice spoke from behind him. "Is everything all right here?" Henry turned slightly, startled by the interruption. The two young men turned too, their expressions shifting from amusement to surprise. The man who had stepped forward looked ordinary at first glance. He was wearing simple clothes, nothing fancy, just jeans and a jacket. But there was something different about him, something in the way he stood. Something in the way he spoke, his voice wasn't loud, but it carried weight. The two men stared at him, confused by the sudden interruption. Henry blinked, unsure what to say. His throat tightened again, and he felt embarrassed that someone had stepped in. "Everything fine?" The man asked again, stepping up beside Henry, not in front of him. Not aggressively, just close enough to show support. The two young men exchanged a quick glance. "We're just talking," one of them said. Shrugging, talking, the man repeated. His tone calm but firm. The way he said it made the word feel heavier. Henry stood quietly, unsure what would happen next. He didn't want to cause trouble. He didn't want anything to escalate. But he also felt a small flicker of relief, knowing someone finally stood beside him. The man in plain clothes didn't raise his voice or make any sudden movements. He simply kept his eyes on the two men, his posture relaxed but unwavering. Henry could feel something changing in the air around them. The confidence the men had shown earlier began to fade, replaced by a subtle shift, a hint of caution. Henry didn't know who the stranger was. He didn't know why he chose to step in when no one else had, but he would soon learn that this quiet presence, this calm figure, was not someone the two young men should have underestimated. For now, though Henry simply stood there, his groceries in his cart, the breeze brushing against his face, and a silent hope beginning to settle in his chest, Henry stood still beside his cart, unsure of what to expect next. The air between the three men felt heavy, as if the space had tightened around them. The two young men, who had been relaxed and laughing just moments earlier, suddenly shifted their stance. Their shoulders stiffened, and their eyes darted between Henry and the man who had stepped in. The man in plain clothes didn't look threatening. He wasn't towering over anyone, nor did he raise his voice. He simply stood there with a calm, steady expression, an expression that carried more strength than any loud words could. "Is there a problem here?" he asked one more time, his voice low but clear. The young men hesitated. One of them lifted his hand slightly, as if to show innocence. "We said we're just talking, man," he answered. "Why are you getting involved?" The man didn't react to the defensive tone. Instead, he turned his eyes toward Henry, giving him a moment of full attention. "Sir, are you okay?" he asked gently. Henry swallowed and nodded slowly. "I'm fine," he said, though his voice trembled. He didn't want to cause trouble. At the same time, it felt strangely comforting to have someone acknowledge what was happening. The man returned his gaze to the younger men. His eyes were calm but sharp, almost like he was evaluating something quietly. "It didn't look like a simple conversation," he said. The two men shifted again, suddenly aware that they were being watched by more people. A few shoppers near the exit had stopped to observe. Though they didn't step forward, their eyes were fixed on the situation. The plainclothes man stepped beside Henry, not blocking him, but standing close enough to show that he was there on purpose. "If you have something to say to him," he told the young men, "you can say it respectfully. Otherwise, step back." There was no anger in his tone, just a calm certainty that made the words feel final. The young men exchanged a quick look. Their earlier confidence wavered now. One of them forced a laugh. "Relax, old man," he said, trying to downplay the situation. "We're not doing anything." The man didn't smile. He didn't argue. He simply stood there, and somehow that was enough to shift the atmosphere completely. Henry's heart was beating fast. He wasn't used to anyone standing up for him, especially not a stranger. He tried to steady his breathing as he watched the quiet standoff unfold. "Let him go on his way," the man said. The words were simple, but the tone behind them carried authority, not loud. Not aggressive, just firm. The two young men hesitated again. They weren't sure who they were dealing with. Something about the man's posture made them uneasy. He didn't look like someone they could intimidate. His stance was too controlled, his eyes too steady. There was a stillness about him that didn't match the average shopper. Finally, one of them muttered, "Whatever," under his breath, and took a small step back. The other followed, though he looked more annoyed than anything. "We're not scared of you," he said quietly. But even he didn't sound confident anymore. The man didn't respond to the comment. He simply watched them with the same unreadable expression. Henry let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. His hands still trembled slightly, but now the fear was mixed with something else, relief. "Thank you," Henry said softly, turning his head just enough to look at the man. The man gave a small nod. "You're all right," he replied. "Let's get you to a safer spot." He placed a gentle hand on the side of Henry's cart, guiding it carefully without taking control away from him. The gesture was small, but it felt thoughtful, like the man didn't want Henry to feel helpless. They moved slowly toward the bench near the front of the store, just past the exit. Henry walked with caution, not wanting his shaky legs to give out. The man stayed beside him the whole time, watching him carefully but respectfully. Once Henry sat down, he set his hands on his lap, trying to stop the trembling. The man lowered himself onto the bench beside him, making sure Henry had enough space. "You handled that well," the man said. Henry gave a tired smile. I didn't handle much." He didn't react in anger. "That takes strength." Henry glanced down. "I just didn't want any trouble." "You weren't the one causing it," the man replied. "But you shouldn't have had to deal with that alone." Henry nodded slowly. He looked out at the parking lot, where the two young men were now loitering near their car, leaning against it and talking. They kept glancing back toward the store, but they stayed where they were. The man followed Henry's gaze. "Don't worry about them," he said calmly. "They won't come back over here." Henry hesitated. "Why are you so sure?" The man gave a small, knowing smile. People like that know when they've met someone they shouldn't push. There was something in the man's tone that made Henry curious. It wasn't arrogance or intimidation, it was experience. "I'm Henry," he said after a moment, offering his hand. The man shook it gently. "James," he replied. Henry studied him for a moment. He seemed ordinary enough, yet everything about him felt controlled, deliberate. His posture was straight, his movements precise, his gaze steady. He didn't act like someone who stumbled into the situation by accident. "You work around here?" Henry asked. "No," James answered. "Just passing through today?" Henry nodded, though a part of him felt there was more to the story. "Well," Henry said quietly, "thank you again. Most people, they don't get involved." James looked at him with an honest expression. Most people see trouble and hope someone else will step forward. But sometimes that someone never comes. Henry felt those words settle deeply. For a moment, they both sat quietly. The breeze was gentle, rustling the leaves of a nearby tree. A few shoppers pushed carts past them, some casting glances but quickly returning to their day. Henry cleared his throat. "I didn't mean to cause a scene." James shook his head. "You didn't, and even if you did, you'd have every right to. No one deserves to be made uncomfortable just for being here." Henry looked down at his grocery bags. They were simple things: bread, milk, fruit. But somehow, the small routine of getting them had turned into something much heavier. "I used to be stronger," Henry said quietly. "Used to walk faster, stand taller. Life changes things." James didn't interrupt. He listened carefully. "People see an old man," Henry continued. "They don't see the life behind it. They don't see what someone has carried. They just see someone slow." His voice shook a little, not from fear, but from a truth he rarely said out loud. "I see more than that," James said softly. Henry looked at him. "Why? You don't even know me." James gave a thoughtful smile. "I don't need to know you deserve respect." "Everyone does." The simple kindness in those words touched Henry more than he expected. A moment later, James shifted slightly. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, worn badge holder. He opened it just enough for Henry to see the emblem inside. Henry blinked in surprise. "You're retired now," James said calmly. "But I've served a long time." Henry stared at the emblem. "Marine Corps." James nodded. "Colonel." Henry felt his breath catch. He looked at James with renewed understanding. Everything, the posture, the calmness, the authority made sense now. "You didn't have to tell me that," Henry said quietly. "I didn't," James agreed. "But I wanted you to know you weren't alone." Henry felt something warm fill his chest. Something he hadn't felt in a long time: dignity. "Thank you," Henry whispered. James nodded with the same quiet strength he had shown from the beginning. "Anytime." He sat there for a while longer. the silence comfortable now. The earlier tension had faded completely. Henry felt steadier, his breathing calmer, his hands less shaky. Finally, James stood up. "Let me help you get to your bus stop," he offered. Henry shook his head gently. "I can manage now. Really." James respected the reply, but didn't step away just yet. "All right. But if you ever feel uneasy again, don't hesitate to tell someone. You deserve peace." Henry nodded. "And you deserve thanks." James gave a small smile. "Take care of yourself, Henry." With that, James stepped away, heading toward the parking lot. Henry watched him go, feeling a strange mixture of gratitude and admiration as James walked past the two young men near their car. They looked at him, then quickly turned away. They didn't say a word. They didn't smirk. They didn't laugh. James didn't acknowledge them either. He simply walked by with the same quiet authority that had silenced them earlier. Henry sat on the bench for another minute, letting everything sink in. Then he stood slowly, steadied his cane, and started walking toward the bus stop, for the first time in a long time. He didn't feel invisible, and he didn't feel alone. Here is your 2,000-word Part 3, written in simple, natural, human-sounding English, fully safe for YouTube, and free of violent or restricted content. The moment the door closed behind them, the room fell into a heavy silence. It wasn't the kind that felt empty, it was the kind that felt full. Full of questions, worry, and the kind of tension that comes when people care but don't know what to say. The father sat on the edge of the small couch, hands clasped together, staring down like the answers to everything were written on the floor. His daughter sat a few steps away, wrapped in a blanket someone had placed around her shoulders earlier. She wasn't shivering anymore, but she held the blanket like it gave her courage. After a long moment, she finally spoke. Her voice was soft, careful, like she was touching something fragile. "I didn't tell you everything," she whispered. Her father lifted his head instantly, eyes sharp with concern. Not anger, not frustration, just concern. "You don't have to rush," he said gently. "Say it when you're ready. I'm here." He leaned back slightly, giving her space instead of pressing in. It was clear he wanted answers, but not at the cost of overwhelming her. She took a deep breath, the kind that shakes a bit in the middle. "I didn't know who to trust," she said. "Everything happened so fast. I didn't know what they wanted from me. I didn't know what to do. I just froze." Her voice faded before she finished the last word. Her father nodded slowly. Henry stepped off the bus slowly, careful with each movement. His hands were still slightly shaky from the earlier confrontation, even though some time had passed. The bus stop was a few streets away from his small apartment, a quiet place tucked into an older part of town. As he began walking, he kept replaying the moment when James introduced himself not loudly or proudly, but in a calm, humble way that made the title colonel feel even more powerful. Henry had met many people in his lifetime. Some talked big, some acted tough, and some bragged endlessly about their titles. But James carried his whole story in the way he stood, in the way he moved, in the silence before he spoke. He didn't need to prove anything. As Henry walked, he felt a warmth in his chest. It wasn't the kind that came from physical comfort. It was the kind that came from feeling seen. When he reached his building, he paused by the front steps. His legs were a bit tired, but the earlier fear had faded into a calmer, steadier feeling. He took a breath and climbed the steps carefully, gripping the handrail. Inside his apartment, he set his grocery bags on the small kitchen table. He looked around the room, simple, tidy, quiet. He lived alone, something he had grown used to over the years. The walls were lined with old photos, a few medals, and some framed certificates that he rarely glanced at anymore. He looked at one photo, younger version of himself standing with his unit, smiling proudly. Life had been different then. His back was straighter. His steps were lighter. His hands didn't tremble. Henry touched the edge of the frame gently and closed his eyes for a moment. "Used to be someone," he whispered. But James' voice echoed in his mind. "I see more than that." Henry opened his eyes and sat down slowly. Those words carried a kind of weight that pushed aside the loneliness he often felt. He remembered the moment clearly, the calm look, the gentle tone, The way James had placed his hand on the cart not to take over, but to guide. That small gesture meant more than the actual help. It meant respect. Henry thought of how quickly things could have gone wrong if James hadn't stepped in. He knew he wasn't as fast or strong anymore. He knew he couldn't defend himself like he once could. That had been hard to accept over the years, but today reminded him that not. Everyone looked at him as weak or invisible. For a long while, Henry sat in silence, letting the day settle in his mind. Across town, James sat inside his quiet car in the grocery store parking lot. He didn't start the engine immediately. Instead, he rested his hands on the steering wheel and looked out at the people walking in and out of the store. He had seen situations like that many times, people picking on someone who couldn't or wouldn't fight back. It never sat right with him. Even after leaving his position, even after stepping away from the life he had known for decades, something inside him still responded whenever he saw unfairness. He finally started the car and pulled out of the parking lot, driving through the city. He found himself thinking about Henry. Something about the older man's quiet struggle had struck him in a deeper way than he expected. Maybe it reminded him of friends he had lost. People who had served bravely but returned home to a world that didn't understand them anymore. James had seen strong people break in silence. He had seen others hide their pain so deeply that no one ever noticed until it was too late. Henry had carried something in his eyes, a mixture of pride, sadness, and exhaustion. It wasn't unusual. Many who had served carried something similar. But what mattered was how alone he had seemed. James tapped the steering wheel lightly, a habit he developed when he was deep in thought. He deserved better, he murmured. He didn't mean just today. He meant in general. James continued driving. But the image of Henry sitting on that bench stayed in his mind. The next morning, Henry woke earlier than usual. The sunlight slipped through the curtains, casting warm stripes across the floor. His joints ached a bit, but he felt more awake than he had in days. He went about his small morning routine, washing up, boiling water for tea, warming a slice of bread. He sat at his small table, sipping slowly. His thoughts wandered back to the grocery store. He wondered where James was now. He wondered what had brought him to that store on that day. It felt like one of those rare moments when timing aligned in a way that made life feel a little less random. Henry finished his tea, washed the cup, and decided to step outside for some fresh air. The weather was pleasant, and the streets were peaceful. As he walked down the sidewalk, he noticed a few neighbors passing by. Most nodded politely, some smiled, but no one stopped to talk for long. People had busy lives, and Henry didn't expect anything different. Yet today, he felt a little more hopeful. Meanwhile, James sat in a quiet cafe not far from his hotel. He was passing through town on his way to visit an old friend. He didn't stay in one place for long these days, but something pushed him to take a detour this morning. He found himself looking up places nearby that helped older veterans, support groups, community centers, small volunteer programs. He didn't know why he was doing it exactly. He told himself he was just browsing, but deep down, he knew the truth. Henry reminded him of the men he had once led, men who had given everything and received little in return. Men who deserved dignity, respect, and support. He rubbed a hand across his jaw and leaned back in his chair. "All right," he murmured to himself. "One more stop before I leave." Henry spent the afternoon sitting in the small community garden behind his building. He liked watching the birds. He liked the quiet. He liked the sense of being outside, without being surrounded by crowds. He leaned back in the wooden bench and let out a slow breath. Then he heard footsteps. He looked up, and his eyes widened. James stood there, holding a small paper bag in one hand. Henry blinked. You're here?" James smiled gently. "Thought I'd check on you. Is that all right?" Henry nodded quickly. "Of course, I just didn't expect it." James sat down beside him, placing the paper bag on the ground. "I was heading out of town today," he explained. "But before I go, I wanted to see how you were doing." Henry felt a warm wave of appreciation. "I'm better. Yesterday was something, but I'm all right now." James nodded. "Good. You handled it well." Henry chuckled softly. "I don't know if I'd call it that. All I did was try not to fall over." James smiled. Strength doesn't always look like standing tall. Sometimes it's just not giving up. Henry looked away for a moment, humbled. James reached for the paper bag. I brought you something. Henry looked curious. What is it? James opened the bag and took out a small, simple wooden cane topper. Smooth, polished, and shaped to fit comfortably in the palm of a hand. Saw this at a small shop this morning, James said. I figured you might like it. Henry stared at it with wide eyes. It's very kind. You didn't have to, I know, James replied softly. But I wanted to. Henry accepted the topper carefully, running his fingers over the smooth wood. It's beautiful, he whispered. Thank you. They sat quietly for a moment. Henry, James said after a bit, do you have anyone nearby? Family? Friends? Henry hesitated. My daughter lives far away. She visits when she can. Friends. Yeah? He paused, searching for the right word. Life scatters people sometimes. James nodded slowly. He understood that more deeply than he wanted to admit. There's a community center not far from here, James said. Veterans meet there a few times a week. They talk, share meals, help each other out. I think you'd like it. Henry raised a brow. You think so? James nodded. They're good people, people who understand. Henry held the cane topper in both hands, felt something stirring inside, something between hope and nervousness. Maybe I'll visit, Henry said softly. James gave a small smile. You should. They talked for a long while about small things, big things, stories from the past, moments from life. Henry felt comfortable in a way he hadn't felt with anyone in years. When James finally stood up to leave, Henry felt a gentle ache inside his chest. Not sadness, but gratitude. Take care of yourself, James said. Henry nodded. You too, Colonel. James gave a tiny smile at the title, then turned to go. As Henry watched him walk away, he felt something shift inside him. He didn't feel small anymore. He didn't feel invisible. He felt seen, truly seen. For the first time in a long time, and for the first time in months, Henry looked forward to tomorrow. Henry woke before the sun rose. The sky still painted in soft blue-gray as he sat on the edge of his bed. His joints protested a little, but he felt lighter than he had in months. Something about the previous day lingered inside him, something warm, something steady. He went through his simple morning routine, heating water for tea, warming a piece of bread and sitting quietly at the table while the world outside slowly brightened. He looked at the wooden cane topper James had brought him, now attached neatly to his cane. His fingers brushed over it gently, the smooth surface reminding him of the unexpected kindness of a stranger who didn't feel like a stranger at all. As he finished his breakfast, he found himself thinking about the community center James had mentioned. Normally, he would have hesitated. He wasn't someone who liked new places or big groups. But something inside him nudged him softly. Maybe it's time. He stood slowly, grabbed his cane, and took a deep breath. The decision wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, like a small door opening inside him. He stepped outside and started. Walking, the community center sat at the corner of a quiet street. A simple building with a faded sign and a few benches outside. As Henry approached, he saw a few older men standing near the entrance, talking in gentle voices. One of them was holding a cup of coffee, laughing softly at something another had said. Henry slowed. His heart beat a little faster, not from fear, but from that old familiar hesitation he always felt around unfamiliar places. Then he heard a voice behind him. You found your way here. Henry turned. James stood a few steps away, hands in his pockets, calm as ever. Henry blinked. I didn't expect to see you. I thought you were leaving town. James smiled with a faint shrug. Plans changed. I figured I'd stop by before heading out. Thought maybe I'd see you here. Henry chuckled softly. Well, here I am. James stepped beside him. Ready? Henry looked at the building. Then he nodded slowly. Yes, I think I am. Together, they walked to the entrance. One of the men outside looked over and smiled warmly. Morning, he greeted. Henry nodded back. Good morning. James gently nudged him forward. Come on, let's get you inside. Inside the community center was simple but welcoming. A long table sat near the back, filled with pastries, fruit, and coffee. A few people sat at round tables, talking quietly. There were photos pinned to a corkboard, pictures of gatherings, events, memories. Henry scanned the room, taking in the atmosphere. He hadn't been in a place like this in years. A man with silver hair approached them. "You must be new here," he said kindly, offering his hand. "I'm Ted." Henry shook it gently. "Henry?" Ted nodded. "Welcome, Henry. Make yourself at home." Henry felt something settle in him, relief, maybe, or comfort. James gestured toward the food table. "Want some coffee?" Henry nodded. "Sure." While James poured the drinks, Henry stood quietly, watching the room. He noticed a small group playing cards, another talking about the weather, and a few sharing old stories. The place hummed with a soft, peaceful energy. James handed him a warm cup. "Here you go." Henry accepted it with gratitude. "Thank you for everything." James didn't make a big deal out of it. He just nodded, his expression calm. "You're doing the hard part, showing up." Henry smiled. They found a small table near the window, sitting across from each other. The sunlight streamed through the glass, making the room feel even warmer. Henry took a sip of his coffee and sighed quietly. "I didn't realize how much I missed being around people who understand." James leaned back in his chair. "It helps more than we think." Henry studied him for a moment. "You've seen a lot, haven't you?" James gave a small smile, enough to know that people carry more than they show. Henry nodded. "That's true." He glanced down at his hands. "I carried a lot alone for a long time." James didn't pressure him to say more. He simply listened with patience. "Years ago," Henry continued slowly, "I came back from service and tried to fit right back into life. But things had changed. I had changed. People expect you to be the same person who left, but you're not." James nodded. "I understand." "Then as I got older," Henry went on, "the world moved faster. I walked slower. People saw me as old, fragile, someone they could push aside." James's expression softened, though his jaw tightened slightly. "But yesterday," Henry said, looking up at him, "you reminded me that I'm still someone." James didn't reply right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle. "You've always been someone, Henry. The world just forgets to look sometimes." Henry swallowed. The words hit deeper than he expected. As the morning went on, more people joined them at the table. One man asked Henry where he served. Another shared a story about an old friend. A woman came by with homemade muffins and insisted Henry take one. He accepted, feeling his heart warm at the small gesture slowly. The room opened to him. Voices filled the space with laughter and soft conversation. He listened, shared when he felt comfortable, smiled more times in one morning than he had in weeks. James watched from across the table, pleased but quiet. He didn't try to take over the moment. He simply made space for Henry to be part of it. At one point, Henry looked across at him and said softly, "Thank you for bringing me here." James shook his head gently. "You brought yourself. I just pointed you in the right direction." Henry appreciated the humility. It was one of the things he respected most about James. After a couple of hours, people began leaving. Henry stood slowly, stretching his stiff back. James walked with him to the exit. Outside, the air was cool and pleasant. Henry took in a deep breath. "I'm glad I came," he said. "Me too," James replied. Henry looked at him thoughtfully. "Will you stay in town a bit longer?" James hesitated, then gave a small smile. "Maybe for a day or two." Henry nodded. "I'd like that." They stood quietly for a moment. Henry tapped the wooden cane topper with his thumb. "This meant more to me than you know." James glanced at the cane, then at Henry's steady grip on it. "I'm glad." "You deserve good days, Henry, real good ones." Henry felt his throat tighten, not from sadness but from gratitude. "Yesterday," Henry said slowly, "I felt helpless, weak. Today, I feel like myself again." "That's who you are," James replied. "It just took a moment to remember." Henry smiled. A real smile. They walked together down the sidewalk, heading toward Henry's building. The world around them felt brighter, not because the day was especially sunny, but because both men carried something lighter inside them as they walked. Henry noticed how people passed by without looking twice. But he didn't feel invisible today, not in the slightest. And James walked quietly, his presence calm but strong. "You know," Henry said softly, "yesterday I thought the best parts of life were behind me.
Oh.
And today?" Henry looked ahead, watching the sunlight fall across the street. "Today I think maybe there are still good days waiting." James smiled. "There always are. Sometimes we just need someone to remind us." Henry nodded. "And sometimes we need someone to show us." He looked at James. "You did both." James didn't say anything. He didn't need to. They reached Henry's building and stopped at the steps. "Thank you, Henry," whispered. James nodded. "Take care of yourself. And keep going to that center. You belong there." Henry breathed slowly, feeling warmth spread through him. "I will." James took a step back. "I'll visit again before I leave town." Henry smiled. "I'll be here." James turned and walked down the street, his steps calm and steady. Henry watched him go, feeling stronger, steadier, more grounded than he had in a long time. Then he turned toward his door, lifted his cane, and stepped inside, not as a helpless man, not as someone the world overlooked, but as someone finding his way again. And for the first time in years, Henry felt that maybe, just maybe, life still had kindness left to show him, and he was ready for it.